On a cold December morning, 5 police officers make what they think is a routine arrest. Their suspect, a homeless man huddled in an alley, seemingly just another forgotten face on the streets of Chicago. But as they rough him up and toss him into a holding cell, they have no idea they've just made the biggest mistake of their careers. This man isn't who they think he is. He's someone with powerful connections, someone whose wrongful arrest will trigger a chain of events that will expose decades of departmental corruption. As surveillance footage goes viral and hidden truths emerge, these officers are about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person is the one they chose to ignore. The fluorescent lights of the Chicago Police Department's 15th precinct buzzed overhead as Sergeant James Barrett scanned the morning briefing room. Steam rose from his department-issued coffee mug, the bitter aroma mixing with the lingering scent of yesterday's donuts. 23 years on the force had taught him one thing: mornings like this, quiet, routine, mundane, often preceded the most chaotic shifts. "All right, let's get this started," Barrett announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through countless patrols and promotions. At 48, his dark hair had begun graying at the temples, and lines creased the corners of his eyes. The other officers settled into their chairs, the screech of metal against linoleum echoing through the room. Officer Mike Reeves, a decade younger than Barrett but already sporting the cynical edge of a veteran cop, slouched in his seat. His partner, Officer Tommy Chen, sat ramrod straight beside him, still carrying himself with the precision of his recent academy training. At 26, Chen represented everything Barrett both admired and worried about in the new generation of officers: eager, tech-savvy, but perhaps too influenced by the policing shows he'd grown up watching. "Downtown's been seeing an uptick in vagrant activity," Barrett continued, clicking through his presentation slides. "Business owners are complaining about aggressive panhandling, public urination, the usual stuff." He paused on a slide, showing statistics from the past month. "We've got orders from above to clear out some of these camps before the holiday shopping season picks up." Officer Sarah Martinez, 13 years on the force and the only woman in the room, raised her hand. "Are we coordinating with social services this time?" Her question carried a hint of challenge, one that Barrett had learned to expect from her. Martinez had a degree in social work before joining the force, and she never let them forget it. "We've got the standard procedure in place," Barrett replied, avoiding her gaze. "Contact info for shelters, outreach programs." He waved his hand dismissively. "But our priority is clearing the streets." The final member of their team, Officer Derek Walsh, snorted. At 35, Walsh represented everything that made Barrett uncomfortable about modern policing. Built like a linebacker with shoulders that strained his uniform, Walsh had 3 excessive force complaints in his file. All dismissed, all involving homeless individuals. "They won't go to the shelters anyway," Walsh interjected. "Most of them are strung out or crazy. Better to just throw them in the drunk tank for a night, let them sober up." Martinez opened her mouth to respond, but Barrett cut her off. "All right, people, let's focus. We've got our assignments." He clicked to the next slide, showing a map of downtown with red dots indicating known homeless encampments. "Chen and Reeves, you take the west side. Martinez and Walsh, east side. I'll be monitoring from the command vehicle and coordinating with dispatch." As the officers gathered their gear, Barrett noticed Chen lingering behind, his young face troubled. "Something on your mind, rookie?" Chen hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Sir, I was reviewing the department's community outreach protocols last night. There's actually a new initiative for—" "Save it for after shift," Barrett interrupted, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. "Right now we've got a job to do." The officers filed out into the pale morning light, their breath visible in the December air. Chicago's skyline loomed above them, glass and steel monuments casting long shadows across the streets they were tasked with protecting or policing. Sometimes Barrett wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. In the parking lot, Walsh checked his gear with practiced efficiency, his movements precise despite his bulk. "Hey, Martinez," he called out, "try not to write any social worker dissertations on your report this time, okay? Some of us want to finish shift on schedule." Martinez slammed her cruiser door. "And some of us want to do our jobs properly, Walsh. Maybe if you spent less time at the gym and more time reading department policies." "Both of you, enough," Barrett snapped. "Channel 3 for communications, keep it professional." He watched them pull out of the lot, Walsh's smirk visible through the windshield, Martinez's jaw set in familiar frustration. Chen and Reeves were already in their vehicle, Chen methodically checking their onboard computer while Reeves sipped his coffee. Barrett caught fragments of their conversation through the open window. "Just saying, man, you can't save everyone," Reeves was saying. "Sometimes a collar is just a collar." "But the new protocols," Chen started. "Protocols don't mean shit on the street, rookie. Remember that." Barrett watched the last cruiser pull away, then climbed into his command vehicle. The mobile data terminal glowed with incoming reports, each one a small crisis waiting to be managed. He took another sip of his cooling coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. 23 years, and mornings like this still felt the same. The weight of the badge, the responsibility of command, the constant balance between policy and practicality. But something felt different today. A subtle tension in the air that he couldn't quite name. The radio crackled. "Dispatch to all units. We've got reports of a disturbance near Michigan Avenue. Possible vagrant activity." Barrett keyed his mic, pushing away his unease. "Copy that, dispatch. All units acknowledge and respond." The day had begun, and none of them had any idea how it would end. Steam rose from the grates along Michigan Avenue as Walsh and Martinez approached the alley. Their flashlight beams cut through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating scattered cardboard boxes and overflowing dumpsters. The temperature had dropped, below freezing overnight, leaving a thin sheen of ice on the pavement. "Movement at your 2 o'clock, Martinez whispered, her flashlight catching a bundle of blankets that shifted slightly. Through the layers of fabric, they could make out the shape of a person huddled against the brick wall. Walsh keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 15, Adam 3. We've got eyes on a possible 1067 behind 2340 Michigan." His voice carried the bored tone of routine, but his body language had shifted to predatory alertness. "Copy 15, Adam 3. Barrett's voice crackled back. "Chen and Reeves are 2 minutes out. Hold position." Martinez took a step forward, adopting the gentler tone she reserved for community interactions. "Sir, ma'am, Chicago PD, we need you to—" The bundle of blankets moved suddenly, and a man emerged from the layers. His beard was gray and matted, his clothes worn but surprisingly clean. But it was his eyes that gave Martinez pause, sharp, alert, analyzing the situation with an intelligence that seemed at odds with his appearance. "Is there a problem, officers?" His voice was quiet, but clear, carrying no trace of intoxication or confusion. Walsh moved forward, flashlight beam directed straight into the man's face. "Yeah, there's a problem. This is private property. Let's see some ID." "I don't believe this alcove falls under private property statutes," the man replied calmly, slowly. Rising to his feet, "The Building Setback Ordinance of 1923, as amended in 2018, specifically designates—" "Oh, we got ourselves a lawyer here," Walsh sneered, cutting him off. Behind him, Martinez frowned at the man's articulate response. Something wasn't adding up. The screech of tires announced Chen and Reeves's arrival at the mouth of the alley. Their cruiser's spotlight flooded the scene with harsh white light, casting dramatic shadows against the walls. "Sir, we're conducting a sweep of this area," Martinez tried again. "There are shelters available if you need—" "I prefer to decline those options," the man said, gathering his blankets with methodical precision. "As I was saying, under Municipal Code, Section 7 to 28715. Walsh's patience snapped. "On your knees now." He advanced, one hand moving to his holster. "Reeves, get over here and help me secure this smart-ass." The man made no aggressive moves, but he also didn't comply. "Officer, I must inform you that—" Walsh lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, when reviewing the body cam footage, they would have to slow it down to understand the sequence of events. The homeless man shifted his weight slightly, and Walsh's aggressive momentum carried him off balance. It wasn't a martial arts move or any obvious counterattack, just a subtle adjustment that sent Walsh stumbling forward, his grip breaking. "Free! 10:55, Walsh shouted, his face reddening with rage and embarrassment. "Resisting arrest!" Reeves and Chen rushed forward as Martinez protested. "Walsh, he hasn't done anything." But it was too late. The three male officers converged on the homeless man, who had backed against the wall with his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Officers, I advise you to consider your next actions carefully. This situation does not warrant..." Walsh's fist connected with the man's midsection, driving the air from his lungs. Chen, caught up in his first real arrest, grabbed one arm while Reeves secured the other. They drove him to the ground with unnecessary force, his face scraping against the frozen pavement. "Stop resisting!" Walsh shouted, though the man had gone completely limp, offering no resistance. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed off the alley walls. Martinez keyed her radio. "Sergeant Barrett, you need to get down here. This is..." "Control the scene, Officer Martinez," Barrett's voice cut through. "What's your status?" Walsh was already pulling the man to his feet, his grip purposefully tight. "Subject secured. Resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, trespassing." "I witnessed no resistance," Martinez interjected firmly, "and no probable cause for..." "Write it in your report," Walsh snapped. He gave the homeless man a rough shake. "You got a name, Professor?" Those sharp eyes looked around the alley, taking in details that none of them would understand until much later. The security camera mounted on the building's corner, the young woman who had stopped at the alley's entrance with her phone raised. Recording. When he spoke, his voice was calm despite the blood trickling from his scraped cheek. "I do have a name, Officer Walsh, and very soon you're going to wish you had asked for it professionally." Something in his tone made Chen step back slightly, but Walsh just laughed and shoved him toward the waiting cruiser. "Yeah? Well, right. Now your name is John Doe, and you're taking a trip to Central Booking." As they led him away, Martinez noticed something odd. Despite his rough treatment, despite the handcuffs and the verbal abuse, the man walked with dignity. His eyes remained clear and focused, surveying his surroundings with the practiced observation of someone used to assessing tactical situations. She keyed her radio again. "Sergeant, I need to speak with you about this arrest. Something's not right." "Handle it through proper channels," Barrett replied. But there was a tension in his voice that suggested he'd already sensed the same thing. Martinez had. This wasn't going to be a routine arrest after all. The cruiser doors slammed shut, and Walsh got behind the wheel, still muttering about know-it-all vagrants. But Martinez stood in the alley a moment longer, looking at the neatly folded blankets their suspect had left behind. They were military issue, she realized suddenly, and despite having been used on the street, they were meticulously maintained, just like their owner. The fluorescent lights of Central Booking cast harsh shadows across the processing area as Walsh and Reeves marched their prisoner through the metal detectors. The morning shift clerk, Eleanor Myers, barely glanced up from her crossword puzzle, just another homeless man being processed through the system. "Stand here," Walsh commanded, shoving the man toward the height markers on the wall. The camera clicked, capturing the booking photo, those same penetrating eyes staring directly into the lens, blood still dried on his cheek from the pavement. "Name?" Myers droned, fingers hovering over her keyboard. The man remained silent, his posture military straight despite the handcuffs. "I asked you a question," Walsh snapped, taking a step forward. "Officer," Myers sighed, "just put him down as John Doe number..." She glanced at her computer. 247. "For the year, we'll run his prints." Reeves guided the man to the fingerprinting station, his touch noticeably gentler than Walsh's. Something about the suspect's demeanor had begun to unsettle him. Most homeless people they brought in were either belligerent or defeated. This one watched everything, with the calculated attention of someone gathering intelligence. right index. Finger, the technician instructed, rolling the digit across the electronic scanner. The man complied smoothly, each movement precise and practiced. The technician frowned at his screen. "That's weird." "What?" Walsh demanded, moving closer. "These prints—" The technician tapped a few keys. "They're coming up with some kind of restricted access warning. I've never seen that before." Walsh snorted. "Probably just a system glitch. Run them again." The man's lips twitched slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. The technician completed the scan and sent it into the system. "It'll take a few minutes to process. Interview room 2 is open." They led him down the corridor, past cells filled with the usual morning arrests. Drunk college students sleeping it off, a few prostitutes waiting for their lawyers, some gang members shooting hostile glares through the bars. Their prisoner noted each detail with quick, professional glances. Interview room 2 was standard issue. Metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a large mirror that everyone knew was a window. Walsh shoved the man into one of the chairs, while Reeves hung back near the door, unconsciously adopting a guard position. "All right, Professor," Walsh sneered. "Let's try this again. Name and date of birth." The man sat silently, his cuffed hands resting easily on the table. A drop of blood from his cheek had dried on his collar. "Department-issue tactical cotton," Reeves noticed suddenly. "The kind they used for undercover operations." "You think this is funny?" Walsh leaned over the table. "Because I got all day. And trust me, the holding cells aren't getting any warmer." "Officer Walsh." The man spoke for the first time since the car ride, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone used to being listened to. "I would advise you to consider your next actions very carefully. The security footage from Michigan Avenue has likely already been uploaded to multiple servers. Your body camera footage as well, despite the fact that you conveniently adjusted it during the arrest." Walsh's face reddened. "Is that a threat?" "No, officer. Simply an observation of facts that will become relevant very shortly." He shifted slightly, and despite being handcuffed and seated, somehow managed to project an aura of complete control. "I suspect your fingerprint search is about to produce some interesting results." As if on cue, there was a sharp knock at the door. The technician stood there, his face pale. "Officers, you need to see this now." Reeves moved to follow Walsh out, but the technician shook his head. "Someone needs to stay with the prisoner." "Stay here," Walsh ordered, though Reeves noticed his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. The door closed, leaving Reeves alone with their increasingly mysterious suspect. The silence stretched for a long moment before the man spoke again. "Officer Reeves, isn't it? Police Academy class of 2023? Distinguished graduate, if I recall correctly." Reeves stiffened. "How did you—" "Your commanding officer is about to have a very interesting conversation with several federal agencies," the man continued calmly. "When he returns, I suspect his attitude will be markedly different." He tilted his head slightly. "You seem like an intelligent officer. I imagine you've already noticed several inconsistencies about this situation." Before Reeves could respond, raised voices echoed from the corridor. He recognized Walsh's angry protests, cut off by what sounded like Barrett's sharp commands. The man at the table straightened slightly, adjusting his posture with military precision. "And here," he said quietly, "we go." Maya Chen had been walking to her barista job when she saw the arrest. Her hands shook slightly as she uploaded the video to TikTok, adding a simple caption. "Chicago PD roughing up homeless man who wasn't doing anything wrong. This needs to go viral. Nonetheless, police brutality of Chicago PD." She hadn't expected much, maybe a few hundred views, some local outrage. But as she checked her phone during her break 4 hours later, the view count had already hit 50,000. The comment section was exploding. The way he just took that punch without fighting back. Something's not right here. Did anyone else? Notice how he moved when the first cop grabbed him? That was military training. My brother's a cop in Chicago. Word is, this arrest caused some kind of federal situation. In the 15th Precinct's Communications Office, Jessica Torres, the department's social media manager, was already drafting the standard response. 12 years of handling police PR had taught her all the usual phrases. Incident under review. Officers followed established protocols. Context not shown in short video clip. But something made her pause before posting. She replayed the video again, noting details that her trained eye couldn't dismiss. The suspect's controlled movements, the way he seemed to be intentionally positioning himself for the security cameras, his clear, articulate speech. Her desk phone rang. "Torres, Jessica, it's Captain Reynolds. Whatever standard statement you're working on, kill it. This situation is developing." She sat up straighter. Reynolds never called about individual arrest videos. "Sir, no comment to any media inquiries. Direct everything to the Federal Liaison Office." "Federal Liaison? For a homeless arrest?" The line went dead. Across town, in the comfortable suburbs of Oak Park, retired CPD Lieutenant Michael O'Malley was enjoying his morning coffee when his phone buzzed. The text was from his old academy buddy, now a watch commander. "You need to see this." The attached video made him spill his coffee. "Sarah," he called to his wife. "Remember that guy I told you about? The one from the Pentagon briefing in '02? I think I just saw him get arrested." At the Chicago Tribune, veteran crime reporter David Wu received 3 different tips about the Michigan Avenue arrest within an hour. The first, from a street source, mentioned excessive force. The second, from a courthouse contact, hinted at federal involvement. But it was the third tip, from deep within CPD leadership, that made him sit up straight. Check the arresting officer's body cam footage. But more importantly, check who's trying to access it. Every federal agency in the alphabet is suddenly interested in a homeless arrest. Ask yourself why. Wu's fingers flew across his keyboard, making calls, cross-referencing sources. 20 years of reporting had given him an instinct for when a story was about to explode. This one made his journalistic spider sense tingle like nothing since the police corruption scandal of 2019. Back at the precinct, Officer Martinez sat at her desk, staring at her incident report. The cursor blinked accusingly on her screen as she struggled with what to write. The truth? The official version? Some carefully worded middle ground? Her phone lit up with a text from Chen. "You need to see what's happening online." The video had jumped platforms: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, each with their own viral momentum. Amateur analysts were breaking down the footage frame by frame. Someone had enhanced the audio, catching the suspect's calm citations of municipal code. A Reddit thread was compiling evidence suggesting the man's military background. In the break room, Walsh stared at his own phone, his face growing paler with each scroll. Comments were identifying him by name, digging up his previous complaints, calling for his badge. "They don't understand," he muttered. It was just another homeless guy. How are we supposed to know? But they had known something was different. They'd all felt it. The man's composure, his knowledge, his confident prediction that everything would change. Now, watching the incident explode across social media, Walsh realized they'd walked right into something much bigger than a routine arrest. His phone buzzed, a department-wide alert. All officers involved in the Michigan Avenue incident were to report to the captain's office immediately. No exceptions. The first ripples were becoming waves. Sarah Chen's corner office at the Civil Rights Legal Foundation overlooked Grant Park, though she rarely took time to admire the view. This morning, her attention was fixed on her dual monitors, coffee growing cold beside her keyboard as she watched the Michigan Avenue arrest video for the 5th time. "Pause it right there," she instructed her assistant, Kevin. "Look at his stance when Officer Walsh approaches. Classic defensive posture, but there's something else." Kevin leaned closer. "Military training. We've seen that before in homeless vets." "No, this is different." Sarah ran her fingers through her short black hair, a habit from her days arguing in cases before the Supreme Court. At 38, she'd handled enough police misconduct cases to fill a library, but something about this one set off every instinct she'd developed over her 15-year career. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Judge Martinez, no relation to the officer involved. "Sarah, tell me you're looking into this morning's incident." She typed back quickly, "Already on it. What are you hearing?" The response came immediately. "Unusual activity at federal level. Someone pulled strings to expedite processing. Fingerprint records accessed by multiple agencies simultaneously." Sarah straightened in her chair. The homeless population had an unfortunate familiarity with the criminal justice system, but federal agency involvement in a simple street arrest, that was new. "Kevin, get me everything you can on the arresting officers. Start with Walsh, he's the one who threw the punch, and find out which federal agencies are involved." "On it." Kevin paused at the door. "What about the press? Wu from the Tribune's been calling every hour." "Not yet." Sarah turned back to the video, focusing on the suspect's face. Despite the rough treatment, his eyes remained alert, analytical. "First, we need to figure out who our mystery man is." Her laptop pinged with an email alert. The subject line made. Her inhaled sharply. Michigan Avenue incident. Eyes only. The sender, Robert Hammond, her old mentor from Yale Law. "Sarah, if you're looking into this morning's arrest, proceed with extreme caution. The man in question, we worked with him on the Geneva Convention's Revision Committee in 15. Whatever he's doing on the streets, it's not by accident. Call. My secure line, Bob." Sarah sat back, mind racing. The Geneva Convention's committee, that had been a gathering of the world's top legal minds, military strategists, and human rights experts. What was one of them doing sleeping in a Chicago alley? She reached for her phone, then stopped. Instead, she pulled up the precinct's number. Chicago Police Department, 15th Precinct. "This is Attorney Sarah Chen from the Civil Rights Legal Foundation. I need to speak with your watch commander regarding this morning's arrest on Michigan Avenue." A pause. "Please, hold." While waiting, Sarah opened her secure database, typing in parameters based on her mentor's email. The Geneva Committee had been extensively photographed. If she could cross-reference those images with the arrest footage. "Ms. Chen?" A new voice, heavy with authority. "This is Captain Reynolds. I understand you're inquiring about an arrest." "Captain, I'm preparing to file an emergency injunction regarding the treatment of your suspect. I'd suggest we discuss this before it escalates further." "Ms. Chen, this matter has been transferred to federal jurisdiction. Any inquiries should be directed—" "Captain," Sarah cut in, her voice carrying the steel that had made her the youngest partner in her firm's history. "In exactly 1 hour, I'm holding a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. I can either announce that the CPD is cooperating fully with our investigation into civil rights violations, or I can raise questions about why multiple federal agencies are suddenly interested in a homeless arrest. Which headline would you prefer?" The silence stretched for 10 seconds. When Reynolds spoke again, his tone had shifted. "Give me 30 minutes to make some calls." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. 20 minutes, Captain. After that, I'm walking into CNN's local bureau with frame-by-frame analysis of your officer's body cam footage." She hung up and turned to find Kevin standing in her doorway, face pale. "Sarah, you need to see this. I got into Walsh's service record. There's a pattern of complaints involving homeless citizens. But more importantly, I found out why the feds are involved." He handed her a tablet. As she read, her eyes widened. "Get Judge Martinez on the phone, now. And Kevin, cancel my afternoon appointments. This just became something much bigger than a civil rights case." The tablet displayed a heavily redacted document, but one line stood out clearly. "Subject's identity confirmed. Code level Alpha 7 protocol engaged. All local law enforcement personnel to stand down immediately." Sarah looked out her window at the Chicago skyline, mind already mapping out strategies. After 15 years fighting for the forgotten and marginalized, She'd finally stumbled onto something that could change everything. The question was, who exactly had Officer Walsh arrested this morning, and why had he gone to such lengths to be arrested? Her phone buzzed again. Captain Reynolds. My office. 15 minutes. Bring your evidence, Ms. Chen, and come alone. Captain Reynolds stood frozen behind his desk, staring at the secure terminal that had just shattered his otherwise routine Tuesday. On the screen, a classified dossier filled in the blanks about their mystery arrestee, each detail more alarming than the last. Dear God, he whispered, reaching for his phone. Get me Barrett, now. In the holding area, the situation was already unraveling. 3 men in dark suits had arrived, their credentials causing the desk sergeant to practically snap to attention. Without a word, they had commandeered interview room 2, bringing with them a mobile fingerprint verification unit and a secure satellite uplink. The homeless man, though that cover was rapidly disintegrating, sat calmly as the lead agent ran his prints again. The machine beeped, and the agent's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Identity confirmed, sir. He spoke into his secure radio. Subject is authentic. I repeat, we have positive confirmation. Walsh and Reeves, watching through the observation window, saw the other agent's posture change instantly. Gone was the usual federal arrogance. Instead, they treated the man with a deference that made Walsh's stomach turn. Dr. James Morrison? The lead agent said formally, I'm Special Agent Taylor, FBI Special Operations Division. We've been looking for you for 3 months, sir. The man, Morrison, nodded slightly. I assumed you would be, though I had rather hoped to maintain my surveillance position a bit longer. Sir, Taylor continued, Secretary Davidson has requested immediate secure communication with you. We have a priority line ready. In a moment, Agent Taylor. Morrison's sharp eyes focused on the observation window. First, I believe Captain Reynolds and his officers need to understand exactly what they've stumbled into. Please send in Sergeant Barrett and Officers Walsh and Reeves. Officer Martinez as well. Her incident report will be crucial to what follows. In the precinct's lobby, Sarah Chen arrived to find the building in barely controlled chaos. Federal agents were setting up mobile command stations, and a handful of high-ranking police officials hurried through security with faces set in grim masks. Miss Chen, a young officer approached her. Captain Reynolds asked me to escort you directly to Conference Room A. As they walked through the bustling precinct, Sarah noted details that confirmed her suspicions. NSA technicians setting up secure communications. Homeland Security personnel conferring in hushed tones. This wasn't just federal involvement. This was a full interagency response. The conference room door opened to reveal Captain Reynolds, Sergeant Barrett, and the involved officers seated around the table. At its head sat their former prisoner, now wearing a clean suit that an agent had delivered. The transformation was striking. Even without the beard and dirty clothes, Sarah recognized him immediately from the Geneva photographs. Dr. Morrison, she said before anyone could speak, the last time I saw you was at The Hague. You were advising the Security Council on international law enforcement protocols. Morrison smiled slightly. Ms. Chen, your reputation precedes you. I've followed your civil rights cases with great interest. He gestured to an empty chair. Please join us. What I'm about to share will be relevant to your upcoming injunction. Filing. Walsh, his face ashen, started to speak, but Morrison raised a hand. Officer Walsh, I understand you're concerned about your career at this moment. That's not my primary interest. He turned to Agent Taylor. Please display the file. Marked Operation Clean Sweep. The agent connected a secure drive to the room's display screen. Documents appeared, revealing a massive investigation into police department corruption across multiple cities. Chicago's 15th precinct featured prominently. For the past 3 months, Morrison continued, I've been conducting covert surveillance of this precinct and others, documenting systematic civil rights violations, particularly against homeless citizens. He nodded to Sarah. Ms. Chen's previous cases provided the initial evidence, but we needed more. Barrett's jaw tightened. You deliberately provoked this arrest. Of course. Morrison's voice carried decades of authority. Every federal agency has been aware of my presence. My fingerprints were designed to trigger specific protocols when run. The only variable was which officers would take the bait and how they would conduct themselves during the arrest. The old photograph on CNN showed a different James Morrison. Younger, standing on the steps of the Supreme Court, his dark hair untouched by gray. The caption read, Morrison arguing Benson versus Chicago PD, 2008. Beside him stood a young man who shared his eyes and smile. His son, Michael. In the precinct's conference room, Morrison watched the image fade from the screen, his face unreadable. Sarah Chen noticed his hands tighten slightly on the armrests, but said nothing. She'd learned the story during her research. But the others in the room needed to hear it directly from him. 15 years ago, Morrison began, his voice steady, I was a different person, special advisor to the Joint Chiefs, consultant to 3 presidents. My work on police reform was theoretical, academic papers, policy recommendations, congressional testimony. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I had no real understanding of what happened on the streets. Agent Taylor pulled up the next document, a newspaper article from 2010. The headline made several officers shift uncomfortably. Police shooting of unarmed law, student raises questions. My son Michael was 25. Morrison continued. Second year at Yale Law. He was walking home from the library when a patrol car stopped him. The official report said he matched the description of a robbery suspect. The body cam footage, which mysteriously disappeared, would have shown something different. Sarah watched the color drain from Walsh's face as Morrison went on. Michael did everything right, kept his hands visible, spoke respectfully, even cited the relevant statutes regarding unlawful detention. I'd taught him those myself. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. He was always a quick study. The next image showed a candlelit vigil, thousands of people holding photos of a young man who would never grow old. The officer said he saw a gun. There was no gun. There never was. Just a law book and a cell phone. The department cleared him of wrongdoing. Standard procedure. Barrett started to speak, but Morrison raised his hand. This isn't about guilt, Sergeant. It's about understanding. After Michael's death, I continued. My work, testified before Congress, advised police departments, wrote more papers, but something had changed. The screen showed Morrison's impressive career trajectory. Harvard law professor, Pentagon consultant, UN advisor. Then, 3 years ago, everything stopped. I had access to every official report, every statistic, every policy document, but I realized I was missing the most important perspective, the view from the other side of power, the experience of those who face law enforcement not as respected experts, but as people society has chosen to ignore. He nodded to Agent Taylor, who displayed a series of surveillance photos. Morrison gradually transforming himself, learning to become invisible. I spent 6 months preparing, studied homeless communities, learned their patterns, their strategies for survival. Then I disappeared. The first night on the streets was educational, Morrison said, his eyes distant. 2 officers, not from this precinct, took my blanket and told me to move along. When I cited the municipal code regarding personal property rights, they laughed. One suggested I could file a complaint at City Hall if I could find a suit to wear. The next series of photos showed Morrison in different cities, documenting incidents, building evidence. I discovered that becoming homeless wasn't just about giving up comfort. It was about becoming invisible. Police officers would look right through me. City officials would walk past as if I didn't exist. Perfect cover for an investigation. He turned to Walsh. That's why I chose your precinct, Officer Walsh. Your pattern with homeless citizens was well documented, though never officially addressed. I knew if I positioned myself correctly, stayed long enough, you would eventually prove my theory about systematic misconduct. Sarah opened a file on her laptop. In the past 3 months, Dr. Morrison documented 47 incidents of misconduct involving homeless citizens in this precinct alone. Illegal searches, property destruction, excessive force, all captured with hidden cameras and microphones designed by the NSA. Morrison stood, walking to the window. The media trucks were still parked outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Michael used to tell me that real change doesn't come from courtrooms or congressional hearings. It comes from forcing people to see what they've chosen to ignore. He nodded to Agent Taylor, who displayed a series of surveillance photos. Morrison gradually transforming himself, learning to become invisible. I spent 6 months preparing, studied homeless communities, learned their patterns, their strategies, for survival. Then I disappeared. The first night on the streets was educational, Morrison said, his eyes distant. 2 officers, not from this precinct, took my blanket and told me to move along. When I cited the municipal code regarding personal property rights, they laughed. One suggested I could file a complaint at City Hall if I could find a suit to wear. The next series of photos showed Morrison in different cities, documenting incidents, building evidence. I discovered that becoming homeless wasn't just about giving up comfort. It was about becoming invisible. Police officers would look right through me. City officials would walk past as if I didn't exist. Perfect cover for an investigation. He turned to Walsh. That's why I chose your precinct, Officer Walsh. Your pattern with homeless citizens was well documented, though never officially addressed. I knew if I positioned myself correctly, stayed long enough, you would eventually prove my theory about systematic misconduct. Sarah opened a file on her laptop. In the past 3 months, Dr. Morrison documented 47 incidents of misconduct involving homeless citizens in this precinct alone. Illegal searches, property destruction, excessive force, all captured with hidden cameras and microphones designed by the NSA. Morrison stood, walking to the window. The media trucks were still parked outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Michael used to tell me that real change doesn't come from courtrooms or congressional hearings. It comes from forcing people to see what they've chosen to ignore. He turned back to the room. My son died because an officer saw what he expected to see, a threat instead of a law student. I let myself become homeless because I needed to understand how it feels to be unseen. Now, because of what happened in that alley, everyone is paying attention. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about one arrest or one precinct. This was about changing the entire system, starting with the officers in this room. Morrison's phone buzzed with a message from the Attorney General's office. The next phase was about to begin. But first, these officers needed to understand that this reckoning had been 15 years in the making, sparked by a father's grief and guided by a dead son's wisdom about the true nature of justice. Lieutenant Diana Reyes had been with Internal Affairs for 16 years, long enough to know that most cops saw her division as the enemy. As she strode into the 15th precinct, the usual hostile silence fell. Officers looked away, suddenly fascinated by their paperwork or phones. But this time was different. This time she had federal backing, Morrison's evidence, and most importantly, a mandate that couldn't be ignored or buried in bureaucracy. "Conference room B is ready, Lieutenant," Captain Reynolds said, his usual confidence notably absent. "All requested officers are present." Reyes nodded curtly, following him down the corridor. Her team had been up all night, reviewing Morrison's documentation. What they'd found went far beyond Walsh's excessive force. This was systematic, deeply rooted, and, most disturbing of all, sanctioned by unofficial policy. The conference room fell silent as she entered. Walsh, Reeves, Chen, and Martinez sat on one side of the table. Barrett occupied the far end, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. 2 federal agents flanked the door. "Let's begin," Reyes announced, opening her laptop. "Officer Walsh, we'll start with your body camera footage from yesterday's arrest." The screen came to life, showing Morrison's arrest from Walsh's perspective. The audio was crystal clear. Morrison, calmly citing municipal code, Walsh's escalating aggression, the sound of the punch. "Now," Reyes continued, "let's compare this to footage from 3 other incidents involving homeless citizens over the past month." She pulled up a grid of videos. "Notice any patterns?" Walsh shifted uncomfortably as his own voice echoed from multiple recordings, using nearly identical language each time. The same escalation, the same aggressive tactics. "This wasn't random," Reyes stated. "This was procedure, unofficial, unwritten, but procedure nonetheless." She turned to Barrett. "Sergeant, want to explain why none of these incidents appeared in your mandatory review reports?" Before Barrett could answer, she produced another document. "This is a statistical analysis of arrest records from your precinct over the past 5 years. Homeless arrests spike during tourist seasons, business district complaints, and, interestingly, whenever the department faces budget reviews." Martinez spoke up, her voice steady. "They were using homeless arrests to justify increased funding. More arrests meant more officers, bigger budgets." "Exactly," Reyes nodded approvingly. "Officer Martinez, your incident reports consistently noted procedural violations and excessive force. Were these concerns ever addressed?" "No, ma'am. They were filed and forgotten." Reeves, the color draining from his face, stared at the statistical charts. We didn't know about the bigger picture." "Didn't know or didn't want to know." Reyes's voice was sharp. "Officer Chen, you're relatively new. Did your training include specific protocols for handling homeless individuals?" Chen straightened. "Yes, ma'am. We were told they were high-risk encounters, requiring proactive control measures." "Interesting terminology." Reyes pulled up the official training manual. "None of those phrases appear in the approved guidelines. Where exactly did this training come from?" All eyes turned to Barrett, who seemed to deflate under their gaze. "It was suggested by command, unofficial guidance." "Unofficial guidance," Reyes repeated slowly. "Like the unofficial guidance to underreport use of force? Or the unofficial guidance to target homeless encampments when arrest numbers needed?" "A boost." She stood, pacing the room. "Dr. Morrison spent 3 months documenting what he calls institutional blindness. The department didn't just ignore misconduct. It created a culture where certain types of misconduct weren't even seen as wrong." Walsh exploded. "We were doing our jobs, keeping the streets clean, maintaining order. By violating civil rights?" Reyes cut him off. "By treating human beings as statistics? Let me show you something else Dr. Morrison recorded." The next video showed Walsh and his partner clearing a homeless camp at night. As they confiscated blankets and personal belongings, Morrison's hidden camera caught their casual conversation about quotas, promotions, and making the numbers look good. "This isn't law enforcement," Reyes said quietly. "This is systematic oppression, disguised as public safety. And every officer in this room is implicated, some by action, others by silence." She turned to the federal agents. "I'm recommending immediate suspension of all commanding officers, pending full review. Officers Walsh and Reeves will be placed on administrative leave. Officers Martinez and Chen will be reassigned to assist with the federal investigation." Barrett started to protest, but Reyes held up her hand. "This isn't the end, Sergeant. This is where we start fixing what's broken. Dr. Morrison's evidence gives us a chance to rebuild this precinct the right way. The question is, who's willing to be part of that change?" The room fell silent as her words sank in. Outside, they could hear the continuing media circus, reporters still camped out, hoping for new developments. But in here, in this moment, each officer faced a personal reckoning with what their badge had come to represent, and what it could mean in the future. Reyes gathered her files, preparing to move on to the next phase of interviews. "I'll need detailed statements from each of you. Not just about yesterday's arrest, but about everything you've witnessed, everything you've been taught to ignore. It's time to start seeing clearly. As she headed for the door, she paused. Dr. Morrison's son died because of institutional blindness. He spent 3 months being invisible to prove it still exists. What happens next depends on whether you're ready to finally open your eyes. The federal courthouse steps were packed with reporters when Sarah Chen arrived, carrying a thick binder of documents that would reshape Chicago law enforcement. News cameras tracked her ascent, their lenses catching the determined set of her jaw, the purpose in each step. Behind her walked a team of legal experts, including 3 federal prosecutors, and most significantly, James Morrison himself, now dressed in a suit that spoke of boardrooms rather than back alleys. "The filing we're submitting today," Sarah announced to the assembled press, "isn't just about one incident or one precinct. This is about acknowledging a fundamental breakdown in the system of justice itself." Inside the courthouse, clerks scrambled to process the unprecedented scope of the filing. The lawsuit named not just individual officers, but the entire command structure, precinct leaders, department heads, city officials who had turned a blind eye to systematic civil rights violations. "Pages 17 through 43, Sarah explained to Judge Catherine Monroe in chambers, detail the statistical evidence of targeted enforcement against homeless citizens. Dr. Morrison's documentation proves this wasn't random misconduct. It was policy. The judge leafed through Morrison's affidavit, her expression growing darker. "These numbers are extraordinary, Ms. Chen. You're alleging a department-wide conspiracy." "Not conspiracy, Your Honor. Culture." Sarah pulled out another document. "This is a training bulletin from 2021. Note the language about urban beautification and quality of life enforcement, coded terms for systematic displacement of homeless individuals." Morrison stepped forward. "If I may, Your Honor." At the judge's nod, he continued, "During my time on the streets, I documented 873 interactions between police and homeless citizens. In 67% of cases, officers violated department policy. In 43%, they violated constitutional rights. This wasn't occasional misconduct. This was standard procedure." Back at the Civil Rights Legal Foundation office, Kevin coordinated with a nationwide network of civil rights attorneys. Similar patterns were emerging in other cities. Morrison's investigation had cracked open something much bigger than Chicago. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the Attorney General's office. "Chen, White House briefed on filing. Task force being formed, stand by." In the precinct, officers gathered around televisions, watching their world unravel in real time. CNN's legal analyst broke down the implications. "This filing doesn't just seek damages, it demands structural reform, civilian oversight, transparent accountability, complete retraining from the ground up." Walsh sat alone in his apartment, staring at the lawsuit's dense pages. His name appeared 47 times, each mention documented with body cam footage, witness statements, or Morrison's meticulous notes. His union representative had stopped taking his calls. Martinez, meanwhile, found herself listed as a potential witness for the plaintiffs. Morrison's report specifically cited her attempts to prevent excessive force, her documented concerns about department policy. She'd spent years worried that speaking up would end her career. Now, that same vocal conscience might save it. Sarah's press conference continued into the afternoon as more details emerged. "The suit seeks not just monetary damages, but mandatory reforms," she explained to the reporters. "Independent oversight committees, revised training protocols, strict enforcement of body camera policies. Most importantly, it demands a complete overhaul of how law enforcement interacts with vulnerable populations." Morrison stepped to the microphone. "This lawsuit isn't about punishment. It's about transformation. Every officer has a choice. Be part of the problem or part of the solution. Today, we're creating a framework for those who choose reform." Inside the courthouse, Judge Monroe finished her initial review. Her clerk entered with breaking news. 3 other major cities were reporting similar investigations. Morrison's Chicago operation had sparked a national reckoning. "Motion for emergency injunctive relief granted," Monroe announced. "Immediate federal oversight of the 15th precinct begins tomorrow. Ms. Chen, I want daily progress reports." Sarah gathered her files, catching Morrison's eye across the chamber. This was just the beginning. The lawsuit would take months, maybe years, to fully resolve, but something had shifted. The invisible had become visible. The ignored had become impossible to ignore. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Martinez. "They're suspending Walsh. Reeves just agreed to testify. Things are happening fast." Sarah smiled slightly. Sometimes justice moved slowly, through careful legal machinery. And sometimes it broke like a dam, releasing years of pent-up truth in a single rush. This was one of those moments. Officer Thomas Chen sat in his parked cruiser 3 blocks from the precinct, staring at the USB drive in his trembling hands. 26 years old, less than 2 years on the force, and he was about to make a decision that would either end his career or define it. His dashcam recorder blinked silently, documenting his midnight shift, but it was the other recordings, the ones he'd secretly maintained for months, that weighed on him now. His phone lit up with another message from his father. "Son, whatever you're thinking about doing, remember your family's reputation." Chen closed his eyes, remembering his academy graduation. His father, a 30-year veteran of the force, pinning on his badge. "Make us proud," he'd said, but what did pride mean in a system this broken? The radio crackled. "Unit 15, Charlie 7, what's your status?" He keyed his mic. 15 Charlie 7, 10-8 routine patrol. But nothing was routine anymore. Not since Morrison's arrest. Not since Chen had watched his fellow officers cross lines he couldn't ignore. And especially not since he'd started keeping his own records. His mind wandered back to 3 months ago, before Morrison appeared. He'd been partnered with Walsh on an overnight shift. They'd found a homeless woman behind the convention center, surrounded by what Walsh called urban debris, but what Chen recognized as someone's entire life. Photos, letters, medical records. "Watch and learn, rookie," Walsh had said, starting to kick the items into the dumpster. The woman had begged them to stop, trying to save a photo album. Chen had activated his body camera, making sure to document everything. Walsh later reported they had assisted in cleaning abandoned property. Chen had filed a different report, but it disappeared from the system within hours, so he'd started keeping copies of everything. The USB drive contained 6 months of discrepancies between official reports and reality, evidence of quotas for homeless arrests, recordings of shift, briefings where supervisors gave unofficial guidance about keeping downtown clean for tourists, documentation of how many homeless people's possessions had been destroyed or lost in police custody. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Martinez. "Whatever you decide, I've got your back." Chen started the car, his decision made. The Tay precinct lay one direction, Sarah Chen's office the other. The weight of his family's expectations pulled him toward the former, but the weight of his conscience pushed him toward the latter. He thought about Morrison, who had given up everything to expose the truth, about Martinez, who had spent years documenting wrongs she couldn't right, about his father, who had always taught him that a badge meant protecting people, all people. The drive to the Civil Rights Legal Foundation took 12 minutes. Each one felt like a small eternity. Sarah Chen was working late, as he knew she would be. Her assistant led him to her office, where case files and legal documents covered every surface. "Officer Chen," she said, looking up from her computer, "I had a feeling you might come." He placed the USB drive on her desk. "There's something you need to see." For the next 2 hours, they reviewed his evidence. Sarah's expression grew increasingly grave as patterns emerged, connecting dots that even Morrison had missed. "This goes beyond the homeless arrests," she said finally. This shows systematic policy violations across multiple categories of enforcement. When did you start documenting all this? Since the academy, Chen replied quietly. Something felt wrong from the beginning. The difference between what they taught us and what they told us to do, I couldn't reconcile it. Sarah leaned back, studying him. You understand what happens next? Once I submit this evidence, there's no going back. Your career, my career, means nothing if I can't do the job right, Chen interrupted. My father taught me that a good cop protects everyone, especially the vulnerable. What we've been doing, that's not protection, that's persecution. He stood, squaring his shoulders. I'll testify about everything, whatever you need. Sarah nodded slowly. You should go home, get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. As Chen reached the door, she called after him. Officer Chen, your father. He should be proud. This is what real policing looks like. Chen stepped out into the night, feeling lighter despite the weight of what was to come. His phone buzzed one last time. A message from Morrison. Integrity isn't what you do when everyone's watching. It's what you do when you think no one is. Well done, Officer Chen. Tomorrow, his evidence would blow the case wide open. Tonight, for the first time in months, he could look at his badge and feel something like pride. The evidence room at the Civil Rights Legal Foundation had been transformed into a command center. Every wall displayed timelines, photographs, and flowcharts connecting years of systematic abuse. Sarah Chen stood before the central display, where Officer Chen's USB drive had spawned dozens of new investigation threads. It's not just the homeless population, she explained to Morrison and the federal investigators. Chen's evidence shows how the department used similar tactics against other vulnerable groups. Look at these patrol patterns. The map on the screen showed heat signatures of police activity over the past year. Red zones clustered around homeless encampments, immigrant communities, and low-income neighborhoods. But it was the timing that told the real story. Every time there's a budget review or a major event coming to town, Sarah pointed to specific dates, we see the same pattern: increased arrests, property confiscation, forced relocations, all carefully documented to look legitimate on paper. Morrison studied the data with a prosecutor's eye. They created a self-perpetuating cycle. More arrests justified bigger budgets, which funded more aggressive enforcement, which led to more arrests. Agent Taylor pulled up Chen's recording of a shift briefing from 4 months ago. The precinct captain's voice filled the room. Downtown, businesses are complaining about the homeless situation again. I don't care how you handle it, just get them out of sight before the tourism season starts. Sarah clicked through more evidence. Chen recorded everything. Body cam footage that mysteriously vanished from official servers. Radio communications that never made it into logs. Internal memos about maintaining order that were deliberately kept off official letterhead. The investigation team had worked through the night, connecting Chen's evidence to Morrison's findings. The pattern was undeniable, and it stretched far beyond the 15th precinct. Look at these transfer records. Agent Taylor highlighted a series of documents. Every time an officer filed a complaint about these practices, they were reassigned, usually to desk duty or night shifts. Some suddenly found themselves under internal investigation for minor infractions. Morrison nodded grimly. They didn't just ignore misconduct. They actively punished anyone who tried to stop it. The door opened and Lieutenant Reyes from Internal Affairs entered, carrying new files. It gets worse. Chen's evidence led us to audit the department's asset forfeiture program. Guess what we found? She spread photographs across the table, designer watches, electronics, cash, all logged as abandoned property from homeless encampment sweeps, all mysteriously vanished from evidence. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. 2 more officers just came forward, ready to testify about similar practices in the 12th and 18th precincts. The wall-mounted TV showed continuing coverage of the scandal. Local news had picked up Chen's angle. Rookie cop blows whistle on systematic police corruption. National outlets focused on the broader implications. Pattern of police abuse. Exposed. How many other cities? Morrison's phone lit up with a call from the Attorney General's office. As he stepped out to take it, Sarah turned to Agent Taylor. How far do you think this goes? Based on preliminary data, Taylor pulled up a national map. We're seeing similar patterns in at least 12 major cities. Chen's evidence gave us the blueprint for what to look for. Now that we know where to look, Reyes finished the thought. Now we can prove what many of us have suspected for years. Sarah's assistant knocked on the door. Ms. Chen, officer. Walsh's union representative is here. Says his client wants to talk. Morrison returned, his face grave but determined. The Attorney General is expanding the investigation nationwide. Chen's evidence was the key they needed. Full task force, unlimited resources, complete authority to investigate any department. Showing similar patterns, he turned to the room's central display, where Chen's carefully documented evidence continued to unspool its devastating narrative. One honest officer, he said quietly. That's all it takes sometimes. One person willing to risk everything to tell the truth. Sarah gathered her files, preparing for another day of depositions and revelations. Chen showed us where to look. Martinez helped us understand what we were seeing. Now Walsh wants to talk. She smiled slightly. The wall of silence is cracking. Outside, protesters had gathered again, but their signs had changed. Instead of anger, they called for reform. Instead of punishment, they demanded accountability. The system's darkest secrets were finally coming to light, and with them came the possibility of real change. Morrison's phone buzzed with another message from the Attorney General. More evidence emerging from other cities. This is becoming a national reckoning. Sarah looked at the ever-expanding web of evidence on her walls. Maybe that's what we needed all along. Not just one case or one precinct, but a complete exposure of how deep these problems go. The truth, once hidden behind badges and bureaucracy, was finally breaking free. And it all started with one rookie cop who decided he couldn't stay silent anymore. City Hall's main chamber had never been this packed. Every seat was filled, with reporters lining the walls and television cameras broadcasting live across the nation. The City Council's emergency hearing on police reform had become the focal point of a national conversation. Sarah Chen sat at the witness table beside Morrison, watching Officer Thomas Chen being sworn in. The young officer's hands trembled slightly as he raised his right hand, but his voice was steady. Please state your name and position for the record, the council chair began. Officer Thomas Chen, badge number 47239, Chicago Police Department, 15th Precinct. And you understand that your testimony today could have serious implications for your career. Chen glanced at his father, who sat in the front row, then straightened his shoulders. Yes, sir. I understand exactly what's at stake. The questioning began gently, establishing Chen's background and position. But everyone knew what was coming. Behind the council members, a screen displayed a timeline of events ready to show key evidence. Officer Chen, could you describe what you witnessed during your first month at the precinct? Chen leaned forward into the microphone. On my third day of active duty, I observed senior officers conducting what they called a clean sweep of homeless residents near Millennium Park. The official report listed it as routine patrol and sanitation enforcement. What I witnessed was systematic harassment and illegal property seizure. The screen showed his body cam footage, officers destroying tents, confiscating personal belongings, forcing people to move without legal justification. And what happened when you reported these incidents? My reports were altered or deleted. When I questioned this, Sergeant Barrett told me to learn how things really work. Chen's voice remained professional, but his disgust was evident. That's when I started keeping my own records. The council chamber erupted in murmurs as more evidence appeared on screen. Internal memos, deleted reports, audio recordings of shift briefings. Each piece further exposed the depth of departmental corruption. Walsh, seated with his union representatives, seemed to shrink with each new revelation. Martinez, scheduled to testify next, watched with quiet vindication. Officer Chen, a council member, leaned forward. "Why come forward now? Why not earlier?" Chen paused, considering. "Dr. Morrison's investigation showed me I wasn't alone, but more importantly, it showed me that staying silent meant being complicit. We take an oath to protect and serve. That has to mean protecting everyone, not just those the department deems worthy." The questioning shifted to specific incidents. Chen's testimony was devastating in its precision, backed by meticulous documentation. He named names, cited dates, provided evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. During a brief recess, Morrison approached Chen's father in the hallway. The elder Chen, still in his dress uniform despite being retired, stood rigid, with complex emotions. "Your son," Morrison said quietly, "is what every police officer should aspire to be." Inside, the hearing resumed with Martinez's testimony. She brought 15 years of documented concerns, each ignored or buried by superiors. Her testimony reinforced Chen's, painting a picture of systematic failure and deliberate suppression. Of accountability, the real shock came when Walsh unexpectedly asked to testify. His union representatives objected, but he insisted. Approaching the witness table, he looked older than his years. "I was wrong," he began, his voice rough. "Not just about Dr. Morrison's arrest, but about everything. The system didn't make me this way. I chose to become what the system wanted." Sarah watched the council members lean forward, suddenly more attentive. This wasn't the rehearsed testimony they'd expected. "We told ourselves we were maintaining order," Walsh continued, "but we were really just enforcing invisibility, making people disappear so others wouldn't have to see them, making problems vanish instead of solving them." The chamber fell silent. As Walsh described his own transformation from idealistic rookie to hardened veteran, "Officer Chen showed me what I should have been all along, what we all should be." By day's end, the hearing had accomplished more than anyone expected. It wasn't just testimony. It was a public confession, a collective acknowledgement of systemic failure and a demand for change. Outside, protesters cheered as Chen emerged. Signs reading "Back the Blue" had been replaced with "Back the Truth." The thin blue line was transforming into something more transparent, more accountable. Morrison watched it all with quiet satisfaction. "Sometimes," he told Sarah, "justice needs more than laws and courts. Sometimes it needs witnesses willing to speak truth to power." The hearing would continue for days, but its impact was already clear. The wall of silence hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. The conference room at the Civil Rights Legal Foundation was crowded with an unlikely alliance. Police officers, civil rights attorneys, community advocates, and federal oversight officials. At the center of the table, Sarah Chen and James Morrison led the discussion of what would become known as the Morrison-Chen Reform Initiative. "The plan has 3 core pillars," Sarah explained, gesturing to the presentation displayed on the wall. "Accountability, training, and community integration. Each component has to work in harmony with the others." Morrison nodded, taking over. "We're not just changing policies on paper. We're rebuilding the entire culture of law enforcement, starting with the 15th Precinct as our model." Officer Martinez, now serving as liaison between the department and the Reform Committee, pulled up the first detailed proposal. "Let's start with the accountability structure. Every officer will be equipped with new body cameras that can't be manually deactivated during encounters. All footage automatically uploads to 3 separate servers: Department, Civilian Oversight, and Federal Monitoring. There will be resistance," Lieutenant Reyes warned from her corner. "The union's already pushing back on constant monitoring." "Show them this," Chen suggested, bringing up his documented evidence. "When officers follow proper procedure, recording protects them as much as the public." The room's atmosphere was tense but productive as they worked through each element of the plan. Community advocates presented statistics on homeless outreach programs that had succeeded in other cities. Federal officials outlined new training protocols that emphasized de-escalation and cultural competency. The key, Morrison emphasized, is changing how officers view their role. We're not just enforcing laws, we're serving communities. All communities. Sarah pulled up the budget proposal. Every officer will complete mandatory training in mental health crisis intervention, cultural sensitivity, and homeless outreach. But more importantly, we're creating partnerships with social services, housing organizations, and community health providers. And what about officers who resist these changes? Someone asked. Morrison's response was firm. We're not asking for blind compliance. We're asking for understanding. Officers who can't or won't adapt to this new approach will be offered transitions to other departments or early retirement. The afternoon brought more challenges as they tackled the specifics of implementation. How would success be measured? Who would oversee the civilian review boards? What mechanisms would ensure these changes outlasted the initial federal oversight? Look at this section. Martinez pointed to the community integration protocols. We're not just changing how we police, we're changing who we serve and why. Every officer will spend time working with community organizations, understanding the populations they encounter. A veteran sergeant spoke up from the back. You're asking us to be social workers now? No, Morrison replied. We're asking you to be complete law enforcement officers. Understanding the communities you serve isn't mission creep, it's your core mission. The discussion continued into evening, addressing everything from new pursuit protocols to revised performance metrics that prioritize community outcomes over arrest numbers. Sarah watched the various factions finding common ground, making compromises, building something new. There's one more component, she announced, pulling up the final section. Transparency. Everything we're discussing, the successes, the failures, the ongoing challenges, will be public record. We're not just reforming the department, we're rebuilding public trust. The room fell silent as they contemplated the scope of what they were attempting. Decades of ingrained practices and attitudes wouldn't change overnight, but the foundation they were laying felt solid, real. We'll start with the 15th, Morrison concluded. Show it can work, then expand to other precincts, other cities. This isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about building something better. As the meeting wound down, Chen approached Morrison. Do you think it will work? Morrison watched the various groups still engaged in discussion, former adversaries now working together. It has to work, because the alternative is going back to a system we now know is fundamentally broken. Outside, the city continued its usual rhythm. But inside this room, something historic was taking shape. Not just a reform plan, but a complete reimagining of what law enforcement could be. The real work was just beginning. The settlement conference room at the federal courthouse felt too small for the weight of the moment. Sarah Chen sat beside Morrison, facing the row of department attorneys, union representatives, and city officials. The document before them represented months of negotiations, investigations, and hard choices. The terms are non-negotiable, Sarah stated, her voice firm. Complete departmental oversight for a minimum of 5 years, mandatory retraining for all officers, full implementation of the Morrison-Chen Reform Initiative. The police commissioner looked like he'd aged a decade since the investigation began. And the individual officers? Morrison opened a folder. Officer Walsh, immediate termination, surrender of pension, cooperation with ongoing investigations in exchange for immunity from criminal charges. Walsh, seated at the far end of the table, nodded slightly. He'd expected worse. Officer Reeves, 6-month suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, 2 years probation. Officer Chen, commendation for integrity, promotion to training division. To help implement new protocols, Officer Martinez, similar commendation, appointment to the Civilian Oversight Committee. The union representative shifted uncomfortably. And the command structure? Sergeant Barrett, early retirement, cooperation with federal investigators. Captain Reynolds, immediate resignation. The entire command staff will be replaced with officers vetted by the Oversight Committee. The city's attorney leaned forward. The financial terms? Sarah pulled out another document. $10 million in damages, earmarked specifically for homeless services and community programs. Another $5 million for implementation of the reform initiatives. The department admits wrongdoing, accepts oversight, and commits to structural change. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about punishing misconduct. It was about fundamentally restructuring how the department operated. If you don't sign, Morrison added quietly, we take it to trial. With Officer Chen's evidence, the body cam footage, and my documentation, I think we all know how that would end. The commissioner looked around the table, seeing resignation and acceptance on most faces. Even the union representatives knew this was the best deal they'd get. We'll sign, he said finally. God help us all implement this. The next hour was a blur of signatures and official stamps. Sarah watched each person approach the table, some with resistance, others with relief. When Walsh's turn came, he paused. Dr. Morrison, he said, his voice rough. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I'm sorry about everything. Morrison studied him for a long moment. Make it mean something, Officer Walsh. Help us make sure it never happens again. Outside the conference room, Chen waited with Martinez. When Sarah emerged with the signed documents, their expressions showed both vindication and concern. It's done, Sarah announced. The real work starts tomorrow. Martinez checked her phone. The press is already gathering downstairs. They know something's happening. Morrison straightened his tie. Then let's tell them. The public deserves to know that change is coming. The press conference was brief but powerful. Morrison outlined the settlement terms, while Sarah explained the oversight mechanisms. Chen and Martinez stood as living proof that integrity could triumph over corruption. This settlement, Morrison concluded, isn't an endpoint. It's a beginning, a model for other cities, other departments, a proof that meaningful reform is possible. Back at the precinct, officers watched the announcement on break-room televisions. Some looked worried, others relieved. The old system was ending, and something new was taking its place. Walsh cleaned out his desk quietly, placing 15 years of service into a small box. His badge, when he handed it in, felt lighter than he remembered. Chen found himself surrounded by younger officers, all wanting to know what came next. The fear in their eyes was giving way to something else. Hope. The sun was setting as Sarah and Morrison left the courthouse. Camera crews were packing up, the day's big story filed and broadcast. But for them, this was just the beginning. Think, it will stick? Sarah asked. Morrison watched the city lights coming on, thinking of his son. It has to, because now they know we're watching, all of us. 3 months after the settlement, the 15th precinct looked markedly different. The bullpen had been redesigned to include a community liaison office, where social workers and mental health professionals now worked alongside officers. Training. Rooms displayed new protocols, and the walls featured photos of successful community interventions rather than just arrest records. Officer Thomas Chen stood before a class of recruits, his presentation screen showing body cam footage from a recent homeless outreach operation. Watch how Officer Rodriguez approaches, he instructed. Notice her body language, her tone. She's not there to enforce, she's there to assist. The footage showed a female officer calmly talking with a homeless man, connecting him with a housing representative who was on scene. No confrontation, no demands, no show of force. This, Chen continued, is what successful policing looks like. Down the hall, Martinez led a civilian oversight committee meeting. Community members, former critics of the department, now sat, beside officers, reviewing body camera footage and discussing ways to improve interactions. Last month's statistics show a 70% reduction in use of force incidents, she reported. More importantly, our successful intervention rate has doubled. We're not just moving problems around anymore, we're actually solving them. The precinct's new captain, a reform-minded veteran named Gloria Washington, entered with Morrison and Sarah Chen. They were conducting their monthly progress review, and the changes were evident everywhere they looked. "Show them the outreach numbers," Washington urged, pride evident in her voice. Martinez pulled up the latest data. Since implementing the new protocols, the precinct had helped 37 homeless individuals find permanent housing, connected 53 with mental health services, and facilitated job training for 21 others. But the real success story, she highlighted another chart, is officer engagement. 92% report higher job satisfaction under the new system. Sarah studied the numbers. And the resistance? The old guard? Some retired, Washington acknowledged. Others transferred. But most, she gestured to where veteran, officers were paired with social workers, learning new approaches to old problems. Most discovered this is actually better policing. They passed the department's new community response unit, where former Officer Walsh's desk had been. In his place sat a crisis intervention specialist, working closely with patrol officers to prevent confrontations before they occurred. Outside, the neighborhood itself was changing. The aggressive sweeps and harassment had been replaced by coordinated outreach efforts. Local businesses, once quick to call for removal of homeless people, now participated in employment programs and support initiatives. Morrison paused by a wall of photos showing recent community engagement events. Officers playing basketball with local kids, veterans helping homeless vets navigate services, training sessions where community members and police learned from each other. "This is what Michael would have wanted," he said quietly. In the break room, Chen found some of his former critics among the veteran officers actually defending the new approach to a skeptical transfer from another precinct. "Look," one was saying, "I didn't believe in it either, but you know what? I sleep better now. Job's still getting done, but we're doing it right." The afternoon brought a situation that would have once escalated into confrontation. A homeless encampment near a business district drew complaints. But instead of sending patrol cars, the precinct deployed its new community response team. Sarah and Morrison watched from a distance as officers worked alongside social workers, medical professionals, and housing specialists. Each person in the encampment was treated with dignity, offered real assistance, given actual options. "They're not just changing procedures," Sarah observed. "They're changing minds." Back at the precinct, Chen ended his training session with a question that had become his signature. "Who do we serve?" The recruits responded in unison. Everyone. As the day shift changed over, Martinez checked the daily reports. No excessive force incidents, no complaints. Just page after page of successful interventions, problems solved, communities served. The transformation wasn't complete. Change this fundamental would take years to fully implement. But walking through the precinct, seeing officers and civilians, working together, watching real problems being solved instead of just pushed aside, the progress was undeniable. "It's really happening," Chen told Morrison, as they watched the evening shift roll out. "We're actually building something better." Morrison nodded, thinking of all the cities now studying the Chicago model, all the departments beginning their own reform processes. "This was always the goal," he said, "not just to expose what was wrong, but to show what's possible." 1 year to the day after Morrison's arrest, the steps of Chicago's City Hall hosted a different kind of gathering. Police officers stood shoulder to shoulder with community activists, social workers alongside patrol supervisors, as Mayor Richardson signed the Morrison-Chen Police Reform Act into permanent law. "What began in a single precinct," the mayor announced, "has become a model for the entire nation." The statistics supported his words. In the year since the reforms began, the 15th Precinct had recorded an 85% reduction in use of force incidents, while successful intervention rates had tripled. More impressively, officer retention had improved, with job satisfaction scores reaching record highs. James Morrison, standing at the back of the crowd, watched with quiet satisfaction. Beside him, Sarah Chen reviewed a report on her tablet, showing similar reforms being adopted in 12 other major cities. New York votes on their version next week, she told him. Los Angeles starts implementation next month. Officer Thomas Chen, recently promoted to Training Division Supervisor, was giving interviews to national media. His father stood nearby, wearing his old dress uniform, pride evident in his expression. The key wasn't just changing policies, Chen explained to the reporters. It was changing how we define success in law enforcement. Martinez, now heading the department's Community Integration Unit, had numbers to back up his words. Homeless outreach programs had found permanent housing. For over 200 individuals, mental health interventions had replaced arrests in most crisis situations. Community trust scores had risen from 27% to 84%. Former Officer Walsh had found a new role that surprised everyone, including himself. After completing his cooperation with federal investigators, he'd started working with police reform advocates, sharing his experiences and helping other departments identify and address systemic problems. I was part of the problem, he told. A training session for federal oversight teams. Now, I'm trying to be part of the solution. The 15th Precinct itself had become a national training center. Officers from across the country came to learn the Chicago model of community-integrated policing. The old break room where Walsh had once boasted about homeless arrests was now a classroom where social workers and officers planned joint interventions. Captain Washington had been promoted to deputy superintendent, specifically to oversee the expansion of reforms citywide. Her office wall displayed a simple motto: protect and serve everyone. As the ceremony concluded, Morrison found himself approached by a familiar face, the young woman who had filmed his arrest a year ago. I never thought, Maya Chen admitted, now working as a community liaison officer herself, that my video would lead to all this. Morrison smiled. Change happens when people refuse to look away. The evening news would show clips of the signing ceremony, but the real story was in the details. Officers and homeless outreach workers conducting joint patrols. Crisis intervention teams diffusing situations that once would have ended in arrests. Community members and police working together on neighborhood improvement projects. Sarah caught up with Morrison as he prepared to leave for his next assignment, helping implement similar reforms in Detroit. Your son would be proud, she said quietly. Morrison watched a rookie officer helping a homeless veteran connect with housing services, treating him with the dignity that had been missing a year ago. He was right, you know, Morrison replied. Real change doesn't come from courtrooms or congressional hearings. It comes from changing how people see each other. As the sun set over Chicago, the 15th Precinct's evening shift began their patrol. But now, they carried not just badges and protocols, but a new understanding of their role in the community. The wall that had once separated police from the people they served had been replaced by bridges of understanding and cooperation. The transformation wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was real, it was lasting, and it had begun with a simple choice to see those whom others had chosen to ignore. In the end, that made all the difference.